James says ridiculous. I say flippin' awesome. It's Santa dabbing. If you had volunteer appreciation, you would know this shirt. I said I'm going to wear my Christmassy shirt. I always wear a Christmassy shirt when I preach in the midst of December. So this is what you guys get. My 4-year-old switches between calling it Christmas and calling it Jesus' birthday, because that's what we celebrate, Jesus' birthday, that's right. But if you're not a parent yet, I want to tell you, first and foremost, parenting, you realize, is just a battle of theology. Because in her midst of calling it Jesus' birthday, she came with a question, and the more I thought about it, the more deeply it hit me. She said, okay, but how old is Jesus turning? And when you think about that question, the more you get there, the more you realize how deeply theological it gets. Because it is Jesus' birthday in 6 days' time. Well, we celebrate it. And we've been in this Advent series. And so I'm really excited. I love this time of year. I love that we get to, again, gaze upon. Because Advent literally means coming. It's the first coming of Jesus. As Scripture tells us, he put on flesh. Isaiah 7 says that he would be given the name Emmanuel, God with us. Eugene Peterson, when he gives in the message in John chapter 1, he actually phrases it like this, and I love it. He says, he moved into our neighborhood. I think it's such an important thing that we take a moment, just as the early church fathers and early church leaders meant for this Advent season, to be a time of preparation. To, as on the front end of a moment where we get to, again, celebrate and ponder and think about and re-gaze upon the beauty of Jesus' coming, is a season of Advent where we will actually prepare our hearts. That we need to be prepared in heart, mind, and soul for the beauty, the impact, the legacy of what was left by Jesus putting on flesh for you and me. And so right throughout this series, we've been looking at different psalms and seeing how God has been preparing our heart along the way. And today I'm going to take you to a psalm. It's Psalm 73. And I've given this message the title, Reclaiming the Strength and Refuge of Advent. You're going to see why that matters in this psalm. If you've ever walked through an Advent season in whatever church context you might have been in, you will know that there are often themes, Christmas themes, that are attached to an Advent season. Things like peace, hope, joy, love. These are actually the gifts given to us in Jesus' coming. Gifts from God. He gives us His peace. He gives us His joy. He gives us love. And as with any good gift given by God to us, it has enemies that will come against it. It has enemies that will try rob us of our peace, of our joy, of our love. And what I want to take a look at, and we're going to see here in Psalm 73, is what I believe is one of the greatest enemies to the gifts given to us in an Advent season. And it's the enemy of despondency. Despondency is that place that a human heart can get where it feels like there is no way out. It's a space where your heart is so dejected. It's a space where literally all hope has been lost. It's a complete loss of being able to see any way forward. It's the place where we are most not okay. And we get to the Psalm 73. It's a psalm of a guy called Asaph. And Asaph is a significant character, because Asaph actually served as Israel's main worship leader. Now, when you're talking about Israel, the chosen nation of God, in the place of God, in the land that God had given them, in the temple that God dwelt in amongst His people, where He would be worshipped, when you're the worship leader in that time, when the Ark of the Covenant is sitting in the Holy of Holies, I hope you realize worship levels were out in the stratosphere, considering the history of Israel. And in that place, from that guy who is called to do that job, he gets to a place where his heart is despondent. He gets to a place where his heart is in complete despair. This is how he starts out. Truly, God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, have you ever been in that place? Where you know the goodness of God, you've seen Him work, you know, but as for me, I know God can come through. I know God is a God who blesses. I know God is the God who gives me strength. I know God, but as for me, it feels like I've been left out in the cold. My heart is in a place where there's now no hope, no peace, no joy, no love. It's a place of despondency. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. my steps had nearly slipped. I want you to know, if you've been in that place or you're in that place right now, even in Asaph's beginning of this psalm, he gives us a glimpse of hope in that place. Because he says, my feet almost stumbled. I nearly slipped. Because God is actually going to take him on a journey out of despondency and back to a place of dependency. And that's really my prayer for us. I think when it comes to not being okay, we know how it feels not to be okay. I thought about it. I was like, do I need to come up with a fancy story, analogy to make the point? No. You know. We know. We know what it means to reach the place where it feels like there's been complete loss of hope and there's no way out. And I really, in the midst of it, go and question and say, maybe you're sitting there going, Dunks, this is a really great Christmas message. I think it is. Because I think in this time, during Christmas, in an Advent season where we're all excited that in 6 days' time, 7 days' time, we're going to be filling up on gammon and turkey and lamb, whatever the poison of choice is for you. I think it's really important that we hear this message. Because when war is guaranteed, when battles are guaranteed, when enemy and opposition is guaranteed and inevitable, do you prepare for it in the heat of battle? No. Do you prepare for it in the storm? No. You prepare for wartime in peacetime. And so why is it not so good of us to, in this time, where we get to catch a breath, where we get to reset a year, where we get to be around friends and family, just for a moment, grab a breath, to prepare our hearts for the attack of despondency that we know is coming or might even be here already. We know how it feels to not be okay. Second thing I just want to say on the front end is, I hope you hear this, because in many churches and experiences, and even I know where it comes from Scripture, we don't know this to be true, but it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be okay. And that can go against sometimes what we see, because we look at Scripture and so many times we're told, do not fear, do not be anxious, do not grow weary. Even Jesus' words, he says in John 14, verse 1, he says, let not your hearts be troubled. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. But I want to take you to a moment that even in Jesus' life, he knew what it meant to not be okay. Asaph knew what it meant to not be okay. Jesus knew what it meant to have a troubled heart, to get to a place of despondency. In Matthew 26, we find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says this, taking Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee with him, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Jesus is the one who said, let not your hearts be troubled. And then Jesus is the one who experiences a troubled heart. We know Jesus was sinless. He never sinned. So can I tell you, having a troubled heart, experiencing that emotional turmoil is not sin. The question for us is, what do we do after that? How do we journey out of it? Asaph, being set up as the chief worship leader of Israel, experiencing the emotional turmoil of despondency, was not a place of sin. But God was going to help him journey out of that back to a place of dependency. I think it's right that when you see the turmoil that Asaph was in, when you see the turmoil and the stress and the strain that Jesus was under, that emotional response is normal. That emotional response is quite fitting compared to what you are enduring. But Jesus is wanting us to know, God's wanting us to know through his word, that despondency doesn't have to be the destination where we live. We can move out of that space. Back to Asaph. He's under the attack of despondency. That's the place of his heart. That's where he finds himself. And the question is, how does he journey out of that? I want to look at it under 2 kind of big headings, the 2 halves of the equation. Firstly, we're going to take a look at the unrelenting attack. And then we're going to see how he journeys out of that, and what we find is the ultimate defense against despondency and despair. The unrelenting attack. This is what he says. For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they have no pangs until death. Their bodies are fat and sleek. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not stricken like the rest of mankind. He starts to turn his eye to the outside world. He starts to see that there are those in the world who are wicked and yet are finding blessing. It's the process of a human heart seeing someone else's good, and the response in our heart is, it must be nice. Have you ever had that moment where you've been grinding and working, and you've just gone through struggle after struggle after struggle, and a mate of yours puts up on Instagram the picture of them in the Maldives, and you go, it must be nice. He starts to see the outside, and it begins to drip down and destroy his spirit. He continues, and he goes even harder after those who are wicked, those who are evil, those who are actually seeking this outside of God. He says, therefore their pride is their necklace. Violence covers them as a garment. Their eyes swell out through fatness. Their hearts overflow with follies. They scoff and they speak with malice. Loftily they threaten oppression. They set their mouths against the heavens, and their tongues strut through the earth. Therefore his people turn back to them and find no fault in them. He takes a look at those who are evil, those who are wicked in the world, and yet he says, we are the people that follow them. It's amazing. You can have people who are not good, who go about their business in a completely ungodly way, and yet they will have the biggest followership. They will find status and power and wealth in that area. He says for them it is all about oppression. It's all about getting one over someone else. And so any sort of wealth or power or status they have is on the backs of someone else. And then he says, and they say, how can God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked, always at ease. They increase in riches. He says it gets so bad that it's not just about how they go about life, grabbing a hold of all these things. It's the fact that they even turn their hearts, their souls, their minds against God, that they'll even have the guts to question him. They'll call him out. Is there any knowledge in the Most High? And in their wicked hearts and their wicked ways, all I am seeing is they're the ones who are gaining riches and gaining blessing. And this is destroying the spirit of Asaph. I hope through that passage, you started to notice where Asaph's despondency was actually coming from. Because actually, I really believe it came from a perspective problem. The first place he looks is he looks outward. He looks out to the world, to the culture that was around him. I hope you didn't miss in the pronoun use of Asaph's language. He uses actually, it comes out 16 times in 10 verses. They, their, them. They, their, them. They. It's an outward looking focus. Now you're talking about the guy who was the worship leader of the nation of Israel. At a time when literally they held the presence of God in the temple, in the Ark of the Covenant, which we're going to hear about this next year, spoiler. It literally was an extension of the heavenly throne room. The Ark of the Covenant is actually called God's footstool. Almost imagine he's sitting on a heavenly throne. He places his feet on top of the Ark as a footstool here on earth. It's this earthly, heavenly throne room. That's where he was working. That was where he was called to lead. And that guy in that space with that calling gets messed up by perspective. He gets messed up by a perspective that looked outwardly. It actually looked to the culture of the world. It looked to the things like this, the opinions of the world, the trends of the world, what was popular in the world, what was considered good in the world, not godly. He got consumed with culture. And this is the truth he stumbled upon. And it's something that is a warning to us. Culture can kill your calling. When we're consumed with culture, it can kill our calling. We can take in the things of the world. We can take in its news, its media, its ways, its knowledge, its information. And we can do it for many helpful reasons, to be entertained, to be educated, to even make an impact and be an influence in those spaces as God leads us to make an impact there. But when we forget what is the essence of these things, when we take these things in unchecked, what we will fall into is forgetting that those things unchecked are poison to our soul. Those things taken in unchecked will actually be a poison to our heart, our soul, and our mind. And for Asaph, his outward obsession, the perspective of looking out to culture, was actually the thing that was starting to destroy his spirit. Suddenly, the opinions of people and the world trump the truth of God. Suddenly it's not about giving glory to God, it's about gaining glory from man. It's about chasing a like and a follow and a view. It's about gaining status and power. It's about getting one over someone else. It's about our gain with someone else's loss. It puts us in a place where suddenly feelings trump our faith. It puts us in a space where the natural will now actually trump what is supernatural. Asaph had forgotten something. That when it comes to the culture we're placed in by God, when it comes to its opinions, its trends, what's popular, the people outside, we're called not to count opinions, but to weigh them. We're not called to count trends. We need to weigh them. We're not called to count information and count the things of this world. We're called to weigh it, to hold it up against the truth of who God is and His way and His kingdom, and not be consumed that it gets taken into our soul, but simply we don't become deaf or blind to the world that we live in. It just means that we're very conscious that we don't consume the things of the world. It means that actually we're called to that world, so we have to be attentive. We have to have ears that are going to perceive and know the ways of the times. But we're never called to take those things into our hearts, our souls, because when we do, just like Asaph, it will destroy our spirit. He then changes perspective. He goes from looking out to then looking in. Verse 13, he says, "All in vain, I have kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all the day long, I have been stricken and rebuked every morning. If I had said, I will speak thus, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task, until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I discerned their end." I hope you saw the perspective change, because the clue for us is the change in pronoun. He goes from saying they, them, their, to now saying I, me, my. He actually does it 10 times in 5 verses. I, me, my, I. He goes from looking out to now looking in. For looking out, it actually was something that consumed him to the point where it destroyed his spirit. Looking in wasn't any better, because when he looked into himself, what he found was failure and disappointment in his heart. If the outside's going to destroy our spirit, the inside's going to disappoint our heart. He says daily, every morning, I was being rebuked because I couldn't find the righteousness within myself. Later in verse 26, he puts it like this. I think it's a helpful way to understand the place of despondency and failure and disappointment that he was in. He says in verse 26, "My flesh and my heart may fail." It sums up the threefold layer of the disappointment. It says actually like, my flesh. So there's firstly a physical component. Physically, we know that we are weak, we can be fatigued, we can be attributed to stress, that we can fall victim to disease. And I don't know if you're like me, but if I'm tired, if I'm hungry, if I'm stressed, you're not going to get the best version of me. You're not going to get the Duncan who is helpful. You're not going to get the Duncan who is resourceful. You're not going to get the Duncan who's going to make good decisions. You're not going to get the guy who's going to look to God in all situations. Because I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm sore. Then there's another dimension, because he says my heart. And so there's an emotional dimension too. And we know these things go hand in hand. If you've been around me, you know I say this. I often say it as a joke, but it's a joke that's true. Hurt people hurt people. If we're broken in our heart, if we're in emotional turmoil, how difficult is it to then extend grace to someone else? How difficult is it to be encouraging to someone else? How difficult is it to exhort someone towards a perspective change that says, hey, remember God has got you? Because our flesh has failed. Our heart has failed. And that word fail is actually important because it doesn't just mean like a failure or a breakage. Actually, the original word means a complete loss of all resource. It means a complete depletion of any resource that was available. And so at a flesh level, at an emotional level, at a spiritual level, there's this comprehensive loss that I have nothing more to give. That's the place of despondency. That's the place of despair. That's the heart disappointment that Asaph found himself in. The answer was not outside. The answer was not inside. That just led to a destroying of the spirit and a disappointing of the heart. But he gets to verse 17. And this is important because the corner starts to be turned. In verse 17, he gives us hope for what starts to turn the corner. He says, until I went into the sanctuary of God. I want you to know this. The beginning of restoration and refuge is worship. And this doesn't just matter or is significant to a worship leader. It's significant to you and me. That God would actually take him from that place of despair and despondency and disappointment, and he pulls him back into the sanctuary of God, the place of his calling. And that's important because it's not just remembering what you were called to do, it's actually remembering the one who did the calling. It gives us a picture of the truth of who God is. And this actually gives us the picture of the ultimate defense. That's a second heading. Look how his language changes. He goes into verse 18. He says, truly you set them in slippery places. You make them fall to ruin. He turns his attention back to those who are wicked, to those who are evil, yet are getting blessed in the now. He says how they are destroyed in a moment and swept away utterly by terrors. Like a dream when one awakes, O Lord, when you rouse yourself, you despise them as phantoms. When my soul was embittered, when I was pricked in heart, I was brutish and ignorant. I was like a beast toward you. When we go into the sanctuary of God, when we go back to the place of worship, it's going to tell us the truth about who God is. It's going to remind us about who we are dealing with. Because it's going to say, hey, in the midst of all the wicked and evil I see in the world, I remember I've got a good God. In the midst of the blessing I'm seeing those who walk in wicked and evil ways are getting, I remember that I have a powerful God. And so I can remember that a good and a powerful God who has eternity in mind is the God who will right every wrong, who will wipe away every tear, who will not let anything fall through the cracks without being answered for. Who is the righteous one, who is always right, who is just and judges rightly. I remember who I'm dealing with. But worship doesn't just tell us the truth about God, doesn't just remind us of that. It also tells us the truth about ourselves, because it gives us a sense of holy self-awareness. Do you notice what Asaph says here? He says, God, when I was in that place where my perspective was like that, I was like a beast toward you. He understands the truth of the position of his heart in that place. It tells us the truth that actually when we stand in our self-righteousness, pointing like, Lord, are you seeing the wickedness that you're not dealing with? God reminds us that self-righteousness will take us nowhere. If anything, it means we will be opposed to God, a beast toward him. We'll be walking in our ignorance. Place of worship, in restoration and refuge, in the sanctuary of God, will remind us and give us the perspective of God as God. And so in our ignorance, we'll be met with grace. In our going astray, we will be met by the great guiding counsel of God that brings us back. We'll be brought back to a place of calling. We'll be brought back to the place of identity as ones that were called by God, set by God in his house, in the presence of God, by the power of God. Practically, I want to say this. How do we do it? Because I think Asaph has given us the picture that our ultimate defense against the attack of despondency is this perspective change. But how do we actually walk this thing out when we're in the midst of the battle? I want to take you back to Gethsemane. I want to ask the question, how did Jesus fight despair and despondency? Because he felt it in the most extreme case, with the cross on the way. To the point where Gethsemane is actually, it means a place of crushing. It's the place where Jesus would actually sweat blood. Under the craziest amount of emotional turmoil that a human heart and soul could ever go through, this is how Jesus fights against despondency. In Matthew 26, he's going to give us 5 weapons for the fight. Verse 36 says, Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking him and Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Weapon number 1 in our fight against despondency and despair. we're not alone. I hope you notice that the human heart in the place of despondency wants to withdraw. But we make the mistake that we try to withdraw to isolation. We want to go to our cave where we are alone and we're able to pity ourselves there. Jesus does withdraw because there's power in actually getting out of the chaos, out of the noise, so that we can right our perspective. But he withdraws into a close community. It says he takes with him James, John, and Peter, his close inner circle. The worst thing to be in the midst of despondency is alone. That's where it's dangerous. That's where we're an easy target for Satan. Just as Satan would have been an enemy to Jesus in that moment, whispering in his ear, saying, do you realize what's coming? Do you know how bad it's going to be? The cross isn't just going to be a complete physical horror show. It's going to be even more so a spiritual horror show, because all of humanity's debt for the weight of sin for all eternity is going to be placed on you. The wrath of God is going to be placed on you. So forget what's going to happen physically on the cross. Do you realize how bad this will be? Do you really think it's going to work? Do you actually... He would have been whispering. Same enemy comes against you and me. Can I tell you, we can't be alone. Second weapon. It says, then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Weapon number 2. We don't just withdraw to the close circle, we open up with the close circle. Jesus was open hands, open cards with his disciples. He says, this is the state of my heart and soul. I am sorrowful even to death. Can I tell you, Jesus was in the place where his human heart was saying, I'd rather it just all ends. Now that would have been quite bewildering for his disciples hearing this. This is the guy we've declared the Son of God. This is the one we've declared as Messiah, and he's saying he is this troubled. But if Jesus, the Son of God, God himself who took on flesh, who moved into our neighborhood, if he sees the power and the strength of vulnerability in being all cards on the table, hey, this is the state of my heart, how much more so should we be ones who open up to those that God has placed around us, who he's placed there to care for us, to care for our hearts, to care for our souls, so that in that place we know we are not alone. Next one, he says, remain here and watch with me. We don't just open and vomit out our feelings to the close circle. We actually invite them into the battle with us. We invite them into the battle. Because our greatest weapon in the midst of this fight is prayer. And what Jesus does is say, come and watch with me. It's not a passive thing. It's actually a very active thing in the midst of the battle, because the watch he's talking about is similar to like a night's watch that you would do as a military force. When you're seeking to care for your camp or the fortress you're in, you will put men overnight on watch so that they can see if there's any enemies coming, if there's an attack that's going to come through, so that you can rouse your defense. It's an active thing. I hope the challenge to each one of us is asking the question, do we have that close circle? Do we have those people right now that we know? We could withdraw with them. We could open up with them. We could invite them into the battle to fight with us on our behalf, to care for our very own hearts and souls. Do you have that? If you don't, I want you to know God doesn't place you here by accident. He places you here because this is a community that is seeking to be this safe space, to be this space where we can be a refuge to one another. Next one, he says, and going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Weapon number 4, he wasn't just honest with those around him, he was honest to God. He was open hand, open cards with God at the state of his heart. And when we come to God in prayer and we open up our heart, we actually invite God's strength to be in this situation. When we open God up to the battle, we actually relinquish control and surrender ourselves in it, knowing that actually we're not the ones who fight the battle, he is the one who fights on our behalf. It does great things to our heart, because trust me, we're not telling him and giving him the news. We spoke about it earlier. He knows the state of our heart. He knows exactly what's going on. But he calls us to come to him in prayer. where we come with an honest heart, where we open ourselves up, because it's in that we actually can, in faith, give it over to Him. And then the final weapon, it says, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Final weapon for us is resting in God's power. He rests in the will of God, in the purpose of God, because when it comes to will, it's not His will, it's God's. When it comes to power, it's not His power, it's God's. When it comes to His purpose, it's not His, it's God's. And so there is great power and strength for the human heart when we know that we can rest in God's power, not our own. When we can rest in the one who called us, the one who set us, the one who gave us a new identity, the one who strengthens and has become our refuge. And I love, going back to Asaph, how he ends Psalm 73. And I think it wraps up this journey from despondency to dependency so well. He says in verse 28, "But as for me, it is good to be near God." The start of restoration, the place of refuge for a human heart is worship. It is a nearness to God in His sanctuary. And the question for us is today, where's your heart? Is your heart near to God or is it far? Are you the one who is falling astray, turned your back a bit, feeling distant? Can I tell you, the picture for us is God has already drawn near. All we have to do is turn around. He's there. But is our heart right now in this moment near to Him? Near to His sanctuary, near to worship of Him? Because He carries on and He says, I have made the Lord God my refuge. Can I tell you, that's how you make God your refuge, is when you turn to Him, when you're near to Him, when you go find refuge in His sanctuary. And refuge is such an important word, because when we seek to walk out the road of calling and purpose, I think sometimes we think calling means comfort. It doesn't. But calling is comfortable because it gives us a place of refuge in the chaos that is inevitable. The question is, where do we want to find ourselves? Because the battle, the war, the opposition, the storm, it will come. Do you want to be found in the refuge of God, the sanctuary of God in the midst of the chaos? Or do you want to be out there on your own? Walking down a road that says, hey, there is righteousness within me. Look at all the evil, I'm doing such good stuff. Or do we want to find our hearts in the righteousness that God has made available through Jesus, His Son, who took on flesh for us? And He ends it and He says, that I may tell of your works. I think the true power in what God did in Asaph's journey as he moved his perspective from looking out to looking in to looking up is he completely changed perspective, but that changed Asaph's posture. His posture was now outward focused to say, I am going to tell of the good works of God. How important is that in a worship leader? When our posture changes and it is outward focus, I want you to know it's not just the fact that God is our refuge. It means we can be a refuge to others because we tell of His good works. We invite and draw them in because we're drawing them into the sanctuary of God that He brought us into. And during this Christmas, I really want to challenge each one of us. There are lots of people who their experience of Christmas might not be like yours and mine. It might not be a celebratory thing. It might not be a pleasant thing. It might be a chaotic, horrible, stressful thing. And I wonder how many of us could be a place of refuge for someone this Christmas. I wonder how many of us, in the refuge of our Christmas celebrations, could invite others in so that they can know the refuge of God, so that they can know the refuge of His sanctuary, where yes, Santa, presents, these are all good things, but we'll tell of the good works of God. And the most important good work of God was that He took on flesh. That He took on skin and bone for you and me. That He moved into the neighborhood. And so when it comes to a heart that is despaired and despondent, He knows what that feels like. He felt it because He sweated blood in the place of crushing knowing what he would do and what he needed to accomplish on our behalf. Jesus is our strength and our refuge. And the beautiful picture is, as he has made us strong, we can now be a refuge to others. The journey of Asaph is the journey we can go on. Feeling the turmoil, that's not the issue. What you do in that place is important. Your next step is important. What you do after this is important. What you're going to do for the next 6-7 days is important. Because I can tell you could be in a despondent place right now, but next weekend is a different space. Next weekend, you're in a place of dependency. Because God has revealed himself as your refuge and strength. Why don't you stand with me as we prepare to worship again? Lord, I thank you that you care so much for us, that you care to the uttermost. You care to the depths of our hearts. And you know that our hearts can go astray. You know our hearts can fall victim to the enemy of despondency and despair. But Lord, you have given us a roadmap, a blueprint where our perspective can change. I pray we are a people who don't look out, don't look in, don't get destroyed, don't get disappointed, but that we're a people who look up. A people who look up and are encouraged and strengthened by the power of you. Your presence, your power. It is all about you. Lord, thank you that you are our strength, that you are our refuge, that you set us up as ones who can be a refuge to others. We lift you up. Would we be a people who are known as a refuge because God is present here. God's power, His Spirit is living and active amongst us. So that the things of Advent, peace, hope, love, joy, would be evident amongst us, and they would go to the world from us. Jesus, we love you. Would you be with us? Let's worship together.